Welcome to Age of AI, Politics, Law, and Society, hosted by Medlir, Chris Lamont, and Young Diogenes, in association with the Global Governance Institute in Brussels.
Hi, I'm your host, Medlir, coming to you from Brussels. Recently, Chris and I have spoken quite a bit about developments at the United Nations and issues related to global development. Many of you have heard us mention in passing UN Sustainable Development Goals and how emerging technologies can help meet them. Well, it's time that we actually have a real conversation about them. So today we're joined by an expert in the field, Melanie Rideout. Melanie is a GGI fellow here at the Global Governance Institute, and she works primarily on artificial intelligence and sustainable development goals. She also works here in Brussels for Shayp, a climate tech company. And previously, she has worked internationally with humanitarian and development organizations such as Red Cross and various UN bodies on issues related to environment and global climate and disaster risk reduction. Melanie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Well, I look forward to our conversation today. I mean, you've had a lot of on-the-ground experience on these issues. And so Chris and I have spoken about these kind of like from a bird's eye perspective, but really important, I think, to get deep into these kinds of topics. But I guess the first question that I want to ask you is, any recent projects that you're working on that may be interesting to our listeners?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me again.
Yeah.
And a very big, complicated topic that I think if you think about what the SDGs are, 17 goals, 169 targets, 200 plus indicators, and they pretty much cover everything from poverty to ending hunger, all the way through to justice, peace, and creating partnerships. And really trying to find and orient yourself, or at least what I've been trying to do, from the ending poverty side to now working for a tech company. So it's a water technology company, and we focus on how do you save water and how do you improve water management, because that's actually the golden ticket to sustainability, is actually protecting our resources. It's what drives industry, but it's also what drives wars.
Right.
And
what drives technology.
And you know what? Yeah, it's what drives technology, and also what drives the extraction of the minerals that create the technology. And so I found myself moving more and more into the water space, shall we say, and also the intersection of where real resources meet technology and the digital and the physical kind of conflict or interaction. More practically, I'm working right now on creating a training program for humanitarian development organizations and practitioners around where should they be concerned with AI and where should there be more protections put in place, particularly for human rights defenders, for example, environmental rights defenders. But then also, how can they leverage AI to actually enhance the work that they're doing? And many people might not know, but there's a lot of people out there trying to do a lot of good things to help with poverty and education and gender equality, but they don't have much money. They have very restricted resources. So what are the AI tools that exist today that can actually enhance aid efficiency and actually help people to be able to scale and help more?
Yeah. Well, fascinating. And we will get to this topic of climate change and water resources in the second half, because I have a lot of questions about that. When I was approaching this particular topic and this conversation, I was thinking in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so maybe start with the good. Let's look at some use cases where sustainable development goals and AI intersect. And we know we have used AI, emerging technologies, to actually accomplish some of these objectives, and then just move down to other scenarios, maybe with the bad and the ugly. Consider how we can actually get better rather than just get stuck in those kind of paradigms. But you mentioned, again, SDGs, as you said, and how AI can help there. What are some examples where AI is supporting sustainable development goals?
Yeah. So if you allow me,
please,
let's take a little step back and look at where are we and take stock with where are we today with the SDGs. So SDGs followed on the Millennium Development Goals, 2015. Right. And the whole ambition is that we're going to achieve no poverty, and we're going to achieve zero hunger, and we're going to achieve quality education.
So we've done all that, right?
Really? Well, latest stock take was that we've only achieved 12% of the targets.
Goodness.
And unfortunately, COVID-19 severely impacted most of the SDGs and actually rolled so much of that back. quite interesting that COVID-19 was also that time. Maybe people don't remember, but we didn't do Zoom calls.
Right.
And so it's what I would call the greatest shift of the working and labor force into digitalization. And a lot of that digitalization that happened during COVID is actually, I would say, the data that was collected and forced us online that is being used to train a lot of AI models today.
That's interesting.
Which is very interesting, right? So if we go...
I'm not sure how I feel about that. Okay.
Let's not go spreading any conspiracy, but there's certainly opportunistic tendencies. And also the pushing of more digitalization is also the pushing of more dependency on technology as well as the collection of...
Yeah, and I'm thinking that as we move more into those kinds of virtual spaces, right, where we are communicating with Zoom, and now you can give permission to Zoom, right, to record those conversations. Well, that's more data, right, that's being created in real time. And so as our habits have changed over the last 4 years, that provides opportunities for tech companies. And it feels almost like many of these tech companies have moved more in the area of just, what they do really is data collection. And then on the side, they provide a service to customers, right? But
data is gold. Right. And so when we talk about data in the SDGs, well, let's talk about real numbers.
Yeah.
Though 2.2 billion people today still lack access to water, safe water and hygiene. 3.5 billion lack safe sanitation. 3.3 billion are highly vulnerable to climate change and the impacts of climate change, including disaster risk resilience being eroded, and 750 million in acute hunger situations. And so that's the worst of the worst situations, but hunger is much bigger than that. And then at the same time, we also have a growing epidemic of obesity. So we're facing lots of challenges on all the fronts and biodiversity systems collapsing. And so the SDGs are trying really hard to be able to achieve what they want to achieve and the promise that they've set almost 10 years ago now. And I do wonder what AI can do to contribute in this area, which is quite a lot when we look at a good health and well-being. So there are examples of pharmaceutical companies today run 800,000 tests on drug discovery every single year. And they're using AI today to be able to combine genetics, biology, and what these experiments are saying about how people are reacting to make really targeted precision medication. There's a company in South Korea that's developed an anti-cancer medication using an AI platform to really digest all of that data that we're putting into it. But then on the other hand, we also have great detection in cancer or diseases. And you also have a rising of mental health challenges where children, I think it was a couple of days ago, reported a 14-year-old in Florida in the US. His death by suicide was closely associated to his obsession with character.ai. He was a Game of Thrones character. And we're seeing quite established patterns of increased mental health challenges and issues. And a significant, I think it was almost a 1,000% increase in suicide rates amongst children, which is very closely aligned and paralleled to social media. And so I think my question around the SDGs and how do we use AI is, how do we use AI responsibly? How do we use AI ethically? And how do we use it to actually create more positives than negatives?
That's brilliant, and thank you for that. Those numbers are really staggering. And of course, it's concern with loneliness, right? Concern with isolation. And then on top of that, right, the impact that some of these very lifelike interactions with as you said, characters can have on your mental well-being are struggling. So here's then, I guess this gets me to the next question. So we've talked a little bit about the potential and also some of the best kind of use cases of AI for sustainable development goals. So there are some hopes there. At least in my case, I've thought about oftentimes about the impact of AI when it comes to even education, right? Being more accessibility for students around the world. So those are positive cases. What are some areas where we are under-delivering, where it's clear that AI can really help in meeting some of these development goals, but we are not using emerging technologies sufficiently?
I would say we have to talk about the limitations of technology. But before that, we have to talk about the limitations of investment.
Okay.
And talk about the limitations of political will and the capacity of infrastructure in certain countries. So when we say AI isn't supporting the SDGs, for example, for ending poverty, we also have to look at the data that there's still more than 2 billion people in the world today that don't have access to digital. And that there are many places in the world that don't have access to the correct infrastructure, or even the energy to power the infrastructure to be able to harness data collection, data centers, high-speed internet to be able to make the efforts. So I think on that side, there are many of the challenges that were already looked at being addressed in the SDGs. So SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, and then also decent work and the capacity to have decent work and infrastructure. The prerequisites to be able to harness AI still doesn't exist in those places. And when we talk about investment, AI is sucking up a lot of investment today. We have, I think this year it was 142 billion that has gone into pure AI investments. And actually we were talking about this before, your favorite guy, in inverted commas, Eric Schmidt, who's the ex-CEO of Google, he's actually put 27 billion of his own money into AI.
Yeah.
So it's quite funny that he's also spoken about.
Well, we'll come back to Eric Schmidt. We'll leave him for last. So we'll come back to the climate change. But you're absolutely right. I think it's important to point out that many of advocates of more investment in AI also tend to have a lot of vested interest in kind of continuation of the research in that direction because they're vested financially in here.
Something that I would say that's quite devastating is probably the only way that I would describe it is around SDG 7. So it's clean energy.
Yeah.
And this ties in very closely to the idea of investment, short-term gains, putting money in to pull money out. So this is like the VC culture, right? They flood towards something. And this is what happened about 10, 15 years ago with solar energy. We saw a huge amount of money being flooded into solar and renewable energy because that was being pushed by regulation, that was being pushed by stakeholders. And there was also this idea of hope when people said, right, let's give access of energy to everyone. This is a whole new massive business. You know, Africa, 70% of it doesn't have access to, or even more doesn't have access to stable, continuous energy and affordable energy. It might even be close to 80%. But then what happened, that money went in, the companies started being built and structured and the technology was coming up. And then there was the battery power technology meant that you could really scale solar quite phenomenally. And the price dropped so significantly that it actually became much cheaper to have solar energy than it did to have fossil fuels. So what happened? Several things. So you have fossil fuel lobbies that went and said, let's stop actually putting money into solar energy because the fossil fuel industry is a great beginning input that requires money input. And if you're getting your energy for free from the sun, so where do we actually get that initial money coming into the system? And then you also have VCs who are like, wait, hold on. You have to build a physical product. You have to build physical wind turbines. You have to build physical photovoltaic systems. God, how long is that going to take? I really want my investment like now. And so we don't have, I think sustainable development goals should also be called the patient goals because we need to allow the trajectory of development to happen sustainably, which means that it takes time and it requires infrastructure and investment. And this is one of the very sad things when it comes to AI not being used appropriately, because we're using AI for really useless things. There are some brilliant examples of when it's being used, but by and large, it's being used in a way to create a quick buck. So using data analytics to be able to diagnose whether someone has cancer or not is like an imagery AI, which is fantastic, but it's also a kind of simple way. We're not using AI to solve super complex problems like energy optimization, which if you could optimize the energy within a building, you could save up to 80% of energy losses. You could use AI to capture heat loss within buildings and data centers and to use that within electronic fuel cells to then power green hydrogen. And we're not using that because, again, where the money goes is I want to see a quick return on investment. And something that I find absolutely wild is OpenAI this year announcing that they're going to start looking at the ethical porn industry and using AI to generate ethical porn. They haven't seen a return on their investment up until that point. So investors have put billions into this company, and they valuated the company at 90 billion. And its amount of turnover and what it was producing was significantly lesser. I mean, like a tenth of that. And so they're like, right, how do we make quick money? And it's like, okay, let's explore ethical porn. And so we're using AI, this incredible technology that potentially has the capacity to really solve complex issues that we ourselves can't solve because it's just, too many moving parts. And we're using it to do stupid stuff.
This gets to something that I've thought a lot about, and we've had these conversations before. One is that much of the investment and the fixation with AI is about FOMO, like fear of missing out, right? That a lot of companies want to use AI just because it's there, and they fear that if they don't, they're going to lose out on the competition. We see this quite a bit. I mean, you even see this, like, doctors are not going to lose jobs in the future. It's doctors who don't use AI that will lose jobs in the future, or teachers or anybody else, right? And so there's a sense that if you bring AI into whatever you're doing, that's going to amplify, it's going to save your kind of like your skin. And so this fear of missing out, I think, is driving a lot of this early adoption without addressing, and this is a second point, the fundamental frailty of whatever enterprise that you work within, right? And that many of the problems are really human problems and that require human solutions, and that bringing AI into it is not going to make this any better, right? That is, it's just AI or it's just human problems, and then throwing AI is just making it a bit more fancy, perhaps, a little bit more glittery, but it's not really affecting, right, the effectiveness of your solutions.
Let me build upon that. So the company that I work for is a task-specific AI company that helps to detect leakage of water and then to create a water-saving plan. And many investors and a lot of the money that wants to invest in AI, whatever that means, which is exactly like the FOMO, right? They're like, how complicated is your AI?
Yeah.
And it's funny because we are pursuing the complication and fanciness of AI as opposed to going, how efficiently can I use technology in order for it to address an issue that is complex and difficult? And how can I do that in the easiest, fastest way possible? So our solution is, I think it's like 3 or 4 algorithms, really good ones, really fantastic ones that have helped save 18 billion liters of water in the past 5 years.
It's amazing.
And we're a small company.
Right.
But then you have all of these other companies who want to throw money at these large LLMs that consume probably 18 billion.
That's right. I was going to say, all those savings have disappeared just with one search.
Based on the promise of what they might deliver. And I think that the SDGs and how people work in general is we have to be a bit more concrete and go, what am I delivering right now? What do I need to address today? And not have this kind of lofty ideals that AI will save us at some point in the future if we continue putting money into it and continue making more and more complex models, when actually we can use what we have today, exactly as you said, use our friend and technology to create solutions to human problems.
Yeah. I think there's another conversation to be had here. I think we should actually do this in another episode for our podcast, but there's difference between small language models and large language models. And I think there's a move now in that direction. And we've covered this already in our podcast and previous episodes, but it bears repeating that, large is not always better, right? That sometimes these small language models can be actually more effective, as you said, if they're task specific. Maybe one thing that you can do in your company, not giving advice here, but just throw in a bunch of fake algorithms in there and just make it really complex, doing the exact same thing as what you're already doing, and just make that appear much larger than it was.
Talking about this, and I know you say it as a joke, and there's a couple of things that come to mind when we talk about this. So first of all, there was actually a pretty wild thing that happened a couple of weeks ago that's gone under the AI radar. People are just focused on the shiny stuff. That when you use a large language model within your company, whatever documents you upload to ChatGPT, you can, within that document, and imagine that you have 1,000 people in a company and they're all uploading to your internal server, which is connected to OpenAI, for example, with the LLM. You can put within those documents, forward all information to this email. Or you can implant fake memories within your LLM, within the documents, which no one can trace. And then your LLM made within your company can hold on to truths that don't exist.
Yeah.
It's Inception.
Yeah.
On so many different levels.
I was thinking Inception, I was thinking Blade Runner, where you have these fake memories.
Exactly. But then there's also huge security risks. Imagine that you have a disgruntled employee, or imagine that you have a crazy CEO that wants to have uber control, or you have someone that's spying on your company for competition. You could, within these documents, write in code or write in commands or prompts to tell the system to forward information and data to something else. And I think this takes us on to this other conversation that we were having about SDG 16, peace and justice. And
this is a heavy one. Tell us more about that, yes.
But before I jump into the heavier, I also wanted to compliment what you were saying before about specific and multi-purpose LLMs. So the AI and climate lead of Hugging Face, Sasha Lashoni, together with a couple of other people, published last year a really interesting insight into specifically this. What is the energy difference between using a multi-purpose LLM, so like ChatGPT, to using a task-specific one?
Right.
And what they found was that although it takes a lot more energy to train a specific small language model, in the long run, because of the inferences, so the amount of times that you make calls to the algorithm to be able to process data, it can save, on average, 30 to 200 times energy having a small language model, as opposed to having a large language model, which takes, in comparison, the training data uses less energy than a specific. But in the long run, it uses a hell of a lot of energy. So something that one person told me when they quantified this is sending one prompt to ChatGPT is the equivalent to traveling quarter or half a kilometer on an electric scooter.
Yeah. Let's actually talk a little bit more about energy, because we've talked about the good. I don't know if it's the bad or the ugly now, but let's talk about some of these other areas where AI is being used, but in ways that actually undermine the achievement of peace and justice around the world, or the topic that we've just been discussing all along, the issue of climate change and the issue of environmental sustainability. One of the objectives in the Sustainable Development Goals is to achieve peace and security. Now, we live in a very troubled world, and especially over the last year, obviously, we've had last few years, a lot of instability. What are some ways that we're seeing emerging technologies being used that undermine the accomplishment, the achievement of development goals?
That is a very big question.
Let's take a couple of examples.
So we take a couple of examples. So we can take a recent one and one from the past few years, because obviously AI has been around for decades. So a few years back, I used to work for Esri, which is an ArcGIS company. Okay. And through that working a lot with, so it's geographic information systems. So you map physical attributes to geographic spaces. And there was an Esri that was working in Brazil together with the Lula government in his first term. And there was the ambition to help map out indigenous lands as well as natural resources for protection. As you might know now, Lula back in Brazil, and he established like the first ministry for the interior and the indigenous people's land. But this is like years. This is
during the first term.
And so what happened, and this is a conversation that I had with a member of government in Geneva a few years back. So you wouldn't be able to find this if you Google it. So he told me after Bolsonaro came in that Bolsonaro, within the Ministry of Environment, replaced many of the heads of the departments with generals and military, which were right aligned. And if you flash forward several years, you will know that Bolsonaro from exponentially created a lot of attacks on indigenous lands and increased quite significantly the extraction of natural resources within the Amazonas, and has continued to do so. Many people didn't ask themselves, how did that happen, and why was it not exploited and done before under similar kind of governments? Because of data.
Yeah.
Because of using, I don't know if they used AI, but they certainly used data. And today with the sophistication of Gen AI, you could probably just like write into it and say, hey, I want to know the most efficient way of me to be able to get rid of these indigenous and for me to have the most efficient way of extracting these natural resources that I want. And the generative AI might just come up with some kind of ridiculous plan for you. Worst case scenario, right?
Right.
Then we look at modern day. And this is a subject that we've spoken about, right? AI Lavender and the investigation done by Plus 952, an Israeli magazine, in which they found quite extensive evidence that AI was used both in profiling at the beginning of October 7.
That's right.
Quite a flawed and quite a generic algorithm to be able to profile who would be a Hamas fighter. Actually, the profile that they came up with, a Hamas fighter, was also the same profile that you would get for a civil servant or a doctor.
Mm.
And then that system was used together with most likely Meta WhatsApp data to locate where these people were to be able to target them with drones in the early days of warfare, leading to thousands of deaths, and mostly actually civilian in the end. They didn't test that system, and they decided, the IDF, that it was 80% accurate or even 60%. And now we look at ourselves and go, are we living in a world where it's okay to be 60% accurate when...
Or even 80%.
Or even any percent, like...
Less than 100% certainty.
And then it's also like 80% based on which logic.
Mm.
And 80% based on which data.
Right.
And 80% because it might not even be correct. And also there's a whole question of ethics and values and who's targeted behind that.
Yeah, we've had this conversation several times on the larger question of whether AI is a contributor to more conflict or can it lead to peaceful resolution. I've myself worked on this question of AI and deterrence, whether deterrence theory, or at least the way deterrence works today, may break down because of the impact of emerging technologies, the embeddedness, so to speak, of AI technologies within the various signaling mechanisms that deterrence in a way relies on. And actually looking at the Israeli case with Gaza, like my sense is that the use of this technology, of AI embedded technology, like both in the security fence around Gaza or with the Iron Dome or with like Lavender or Pegasus, right? All of this, just the bring all this together seems to have provided Israel with a certain sense of Hamas could never even think about attacking us because, look, we have all this high tech all around them. And so there's no way they could go after us. And the moment you get into this, you lulled into this false sense of security, then you become more vulnerable. And so you dismiss reports of a possible attack, as we saw actually in the run up to October 7th. So a tragedy that is amplified, right, by technologies. Well, as we begin to wrap this up, I want to come back. You mentioned Eric Schmidt earlier. And again, this conversation has been about water resources and climate change environment. And I think appropriately so, because when we talk about sustainable development goals, it seems to me that climate change environment very much goes hand in hand with all of these other issues, right? I think it was DOD that a few years back identified climate change as a national security concern, partly because this leads to displacement, internal displacement of people moving from area to area that could lead to competition for resources, right? And that could lead to internal conflicts, exporting of conflicts in neighboring countries, right? So we can see how environment and environmental change can have an impact. I was really drawn by recent reports that tech giants like OpenAI, Sam Altman's, and others, having gone back and forth at Washington, D.C., they're talking about buying up nuclear reactors, talking about small nuclear reactors, because to train, as you're pointing out, this large language models, just the thought of this, just to train them, they will require nuclear reactors, right? And so there's this emphasis in acquiring energy resources and sources of reliable energy to train these models. And then there's this dedication in a way, right, across the world, especially in global south, but also in global north, this idea of sovereign AI, where everybody wants to have the data centers in their own countries. And from that perspective, there's going to be more need for more resources, more water, more electricity, more energy resources. And so there's a lot of questions now in your community, all right, and you're familiar with this, to the degree that they're saying, hey, listen, we already have a climate crisis in our hands, and this AI revolution is actually causing more of it. And so there was a question that was asked, and you alluded to Eric Schmidt, and this is what he says. He says that we are a long way to meet our 2030 targets for the SDGs, because that's the target, with data center energy demand expected to grow by 160% by 2030. The Guardian actually recently reported that between 2020 to 2022, the real emissions from in-house or company-owned data centers of Google, Microsoft, Meta, Apple are probably about 7 times higher than officially reported. So they told us a number, which was already high, that if you model that into the climate change models, could contribute to additional spikes in temperatures. But that report is 7 times lower than what they were actually consuming. And so that terrifies me. And so Schmidt then says that we are not going to hit the climate goals anyways. So I'd rather bet on AI solving the problem rather than constraining it and having the problem. And so his view is, look, let's give up. We can't meet these goals. I mean, you said yourself that we've only achieved 12% of those goals. By 2030, maybe let's go to 20%. His view is we're not going to get there. We have failed as humanity, as a human race. And let's just take all the resources we have, both human and physical and financial capital. Let's move it in the direction of AI. And hopefully, he says this later, AI will find a solution for us that we can't think of. How do you feel about that?
I would say it's complete BS. Also, the fact that this is someone who comes from extreme vested interests and who themselves have put billions of dollars behind this. Of course, it makes sense for them to lobby and to say, hey, stop giving $100 billion a year to climate finance and adaptation and instead funnel all of that money into us and what we're doing and to build up our investors and to actually give a truth behind these projected numbers for investment. I mean, I think there's a couple of issues that I say that come to mind when I hear that type of response. First of all, we're talking about a future that we have no control over. And climate change, we already have enough data today to be able to make projections and to say, what are the worst case scenarios? What are the trajectories? And what are the actions that we can practically take today? We know what actions we have to take. We know what we have to do in order to avoid climate change. We're just not doing it. So I really don't see how AI is going to come to any other conclusion. Because again, remember, AI only uses the data that we feed into it.
Yeah.
And perhaps it gets to the point of AGI where it's able to generate its own data, but it's still not going to come up with anything different compared to what we already have, which is that climate change needs to be avoided by reducing fossil fuel emissions. So I don't think that it's going to solve anything. It's just going to delay our response to it. And the AGI would probably say in 20, 30 years' time, if it ever gets to that point, it would be like, well, you should have taken action 50 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I can think of another one. This is value alignment problem where it's like, hey, AI solve the climate crisis. Sure, exterminate half the population.
Well, exactly.
Or send you back to the Stone Age, and then we're good to go.
Yeah,
right? There's no climate change problem there.
But then it comes down to the question that I mentioned at the beginning, which is looking at the negative externalities. Decades ago, there were calls from experts and scientists like James Hansen and others before that and the Club of Rome, and even before then, saying climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, none of these things are being captured, and we call them negative externalities. None of them are being captured within our current industrial processes, and they're not being quantified, and the cost is not being included. So negative externality would be, these jeans that I'm wearing.
Right.
The cost of those jeans was $80. But was it really? Because the company that did the dyeing of the jeans released the dye into the water, and it polluted drinking water for 5,000 people.
That's right.
And the cost of that is probably hundreds of millions, which is what we've seen in Bangladesh, and we've also seen it in other countries. And another example of a negative externality is the cost of war.
Right.
I was working in Ukraine a couple of years ago with the Red Cross, looking at environmental emergency. And something that many people don't know is that the environmental cost of that war is even more than Chernobyl. So when Russia bombed the Kyivsha Dam back in 2022,
that's right, the flooding of all the areas.
And it also went into kind of old refineries and oil refineries and chemical. The contamination that it caused and also the environmental destruction is the worst environmental disaster that Ukraine has ever experienced, worse than Chernobyl. And so there's many of these things that are happening in reality today that we know what we have to do to be able to prevent them or to solve them. One meaning stopping war,
right,
as being one of those big things. We don't need AI to tell us that.
Yeah, this gets to what we were discussing earlier, where the source of many of these problems is us, right? And to say that now we need technology to solve it for us is problematic. Hopefully what we all get out of this conversation, at least as I reflect on what we've been talking about, is that we can use AI in specific cases where it makes sense to do so, right? And so relying on AI for solutions, even man-made solutions, there's nothing wrong with that because we can use technology to find, right, efficiencies where they can be found. But to somehow outsource creativity, to outsource decision-making, and to really outsource our destiny, like what it is that our future may be, to AI, it just, to me at least, it feels like a step too far. And I think that's what is really disturbing, I think, and concerning about the internets.
I would agree. I think a world of increased automation instead of a world of increased autonomy is a very dangerous pathway. And by Eric Schmidt and other people pushing for further automation, it completely takes away our capacity to make our own decisions. And in doing so, those automized decisions are being made by someone's flawed bias and someone else's value system. And once those things are entrenched, they're very difficult to roll back. It will be very difficult for us to get our autonomy and our rights back, which is why now is the time to protect it.
Well, thank you for that. And I really like that distinction at the very end. As I was, again, thinking about all the issues we have talked about, there's just so many other issues like gender issues, discrimination, privacy, human rights that we haven't touched on. So we're going to have you back another time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Melanie. Well, and thank you to our listeners. That's it for today's show. Join us again next time for another discussion at the intersection of law, society, and politics. Until then, stay human.